The night Diane Keaton closed her eyes for the last time did not arrive with sirens, hospital lights, or a crowd waiting outside a gate. It came quietly, almost deliberately, inside the Los Angeles home she had designed to keep the world at a distance. On October 11th, 2025, there were no cameras, no farewell messages prepared for the public, no final performance stage for history. There was only silence, the kind of silence that follows a long decision rather than a sudden accident. When the news surfaced, it did not feel like a breaking headline. It felt like a delayed realization, as if something that had already ended years earlier had finally been given a date. Diane Keaton did not disappear that night. She completed a withdrawal she had been rehearsing for decades. Those closest to her would later say that the last evening looked almost ordinary. Books stacked neatly within reach. Black and white photographs lining white walls. A cup of tea still warm. A notebook resting open, not as a confession, not as a goodbye, but as an extension of a habit she never abandoned. Writing was how she stayed present when the world felt too loud. The absence of drama was not accidental. It was consistent. Diane Keaton had always resisted the spectacle, especially when it came to her own life. Where Hollywood demanded display, she answered with distance. Where fame invited noise, she chose restraint. Even her final moment carried the same signature. What unsettled people was not how she died, but how little she seemed to want the world to notice. For over 50 years, she had existed at the center of American cinema, yet she refused to let that center define her. She did not age the way Hollywood expected. She did not soften her edges to remain acceptable. She did not negotiate with nostalgia. And in her final years, she did something more radical than rebellion. She became still. She stopped explaining herself. She stopped participating in the performance of relevance. That stillness, more than any rumor, is what haunts the story of her last night. The world remembered her as an icon of authenticity, a woman who rewrote the image of modern femininity without ever announcing that she was doing so. But authenticity has a cost when it is sustained for a lifetime. Living without armor in an industry built on illusion leaves marks that are not always visible. In the months before her death, Diane spoke less about projects and more about memory. Not memory as celebration, but memory as weight. She once said she did not fear leaving, only being misunderstood for leaving quietly. That sentence lingered long after she said it, because it suggested something unresolved, something private that did not want to be turned into a headline. Her isolation in later years was often misread as melancholy or fragility. Those who knew her better described it differently. They spoke of intention. She curated her days with the same precision she once brought to her roles. Morning routines that never changed. Long hours spent alone, not in despair, but in observation. Gardening. Photography. Writing without an audience. She was not hiding from life. She was editing it. The world she stepped away from had grown faster, louder, more transactional. She no longer recognized herself inside it, and she refused to reshape herself to fit its demands. The final night did not offer revelations in the conventional sense. There was no note explaining regrets, no accusation, no closure neatly wrapped in words. What remained was a single line written in her notebook, a sentence that sounded more like a thought than a message. When the noise ends, perhaps someone will hear the whisper. It was not a plea. It was an observation. Diane Keaton understood something many public figures never accept. Silence can speak more honestly than explanation. Mystery can be a form of truth. Her death forced an uncomfortable question onto those who watched her from a distance for decades. Why does a woman who seemed to have everything choose to fade rather than be celebrated until the end? The answer is not hidden in scandal or tragedy. It is buried in choice. Diane spent her life saying no when yes was expected. No to reinvention for approval. No to romantic narratives that did not feel true. No to aging on someone else's terms. The last no was the quietest, but also the most final. That night in Los Angeles was not an ending shaped by loss alone. It was the conclusion of a long conversation she had been having with herself about presence, memory, and freedom. Diane Keaton did not leave behind a spectacle. She left behind a posture, a way of stepping out of the light without resentment. A reminder that sometimes the most defiant act is not to fight for attention, but to release it. Her final moment was not meant to be witnessed. It was meant to be understood later, slowly, by those willing to listen beyond the noise. Long before silence became her final language, Diane Keaton learned how to live with distance. She was born into a household where ambition and restraint existed side by side, where admiration was earned quietly and disappointment was rarely spoken aloud. Her mother, Dorothy Hall, carried an unfulfilled artistic longing that shaped the emotional climate of the home. Creativity was encouraged, but approval was conditional. Diane grew up absorbing, learning how to read the room before speaking, how to perform competence without demanding affection. That early training would later serve her well on stage and screen, but it would also plant the first seeds of insecurity that followed her into adulthood. She was not raised to be loud or indulgent. She was raised to be precise. Even as a child, she gravitated toward structure, toward rehearsal, toward the safety of preparation. Music lessons, speech training, and discipline gave her control, but they also reinforced a belief that worth had to be earned continuously. Praise never lingered long enough to settle. When she later described her childhood, she did not speak of trauma, only pressure, the kind that does not bruise but slowly reshapes a person from the inside. When she entered the world of performance, she did not resemble the archetype Hollywood preferred. She was not immediately dazzling. Her beauty was unconventional, her presence understated. Yet there was something unmistakable in her timing, in the way she allowed pauses to breathe, in how vulnerability appeared without apology. Directors noticed it. Audiences felt it before they could name it. What separated her from others was not confidence, but awareness. She knew exactly how exposed she was, and she chose to step forward anyway. Her early work in theater gave her a sense of control she would later miss in film. On stage, the boundaries were clear. The story ended each night, the applause rose and fell, and then she could leave. Cinema was different. Film froze moments, replayed them endlessly, turned private expressions into permanent artifacts. Diane understood this instinctively, and it made her cautious. She gave performances that felt intimate, but she guarded her inner life with discipline. The contradiction fascinated audiences. It also exhausted her. As her career accelerated, she became associated with a new kind of female presence on screen. Intelligent, awkward, ironic, emotionally articulate without being decorative. This was not a role she set out to claim. It was simply who she was. But representation carries weight. With each success, expectations grew heavier. She was no longer just acting. She was symbolizing something. Independence, authenticity, modern womanhood. These labels followed her everywhere, and though she wore them gracefully, they quietly narrowed her freedom. Success brought recognition, but not resolution. The applause did not silence the questions she carried from childhood. Was she enough when she was not performing? Was she lovable without achievement? Could she be chosen without proving herself? These doubts surfaced most clearly in her personal relationships. She formed deep connections, but permanence eluded her. Love, for Diane, often arrived with intensity and left with confusion. She once admitted that she was skilled at falling in love, but uncertain how to stay. The statement was not self-criticism. It was self-diagnosis. Her fear was not intimacy itself, but dissolution. She worried that proximity would erase her edges, that belonging might cost her identity. This tension between independence and longing defined much of her private life. While the public admired her refusal to conform, they rarely considered the emotional toll of standing alone so consistently. Diane did not reject marriage or traditional partnership out of defiance. She did so out of caution. The risk of losing herself felt greater than the risk of loneliness. As the years passed, Her career evolved, but the industry around her shifted faster. Youth became currency. Familiar faces were replaced by newer ones with alarming speed. Diane adapted professionally, but she resisted culturally. She did not chase trends. She did not alter her appearance to preserve desirability. Instead, she leaned further into what felt honest. Her style became more pronounced, almost uniform. Suits, hats, glasses, a visual boundary between herself and the gaze of others. It was both armor and declaration. Behind that composed exterior, however, the weight accumulated. Aging forced her to confront the question she had postponed for decades. Who am I when the roles end? Writing became a way to explore that terrain. In her books, she examined memory without sentimentality. She acknowledged regret without dramatizing it. She spoke openly about insecurity, about her complicated relationship with her mother, about the persistent feeling of being slightly out of place, even at the center of success. These reflections were not confessions. They were calibrations. By the time she began to withdraw from public life, the decision was not sudden. It was the result of years of internal negotiation. She had given enough. She had said enough. The world continued to ask for more, but she felt complete. The retreat was not an escape from pain, but a movement toward coherence. She wanted her life to feel aligned, not impressive. That desire, formed quietly in childhood, matured through decades of visibility, and eventually led her back to silence. This background is essential to understanding the stillness of her final years. Diane Keaton did not arrive at isolation by accident. It was the logical conclusion of a life spent balancing exposure with restraint, love with self-preservation, recognition with privacy. Every choice she made early on prepared her for that ending. Not an ending marked by absence, but by intention. The past did not haunt her. It instructed her. The shift did not announce itself with a single event. There was no scandal, no public breakdown, no abrupt cancellation that could be pointed to as the moment everything changed. Instead, it unfolded quietly, almost invisibly, over the final years of Diane Keaton's life. Invitations went unanswered. Phone calls were returned days later, if at all. Projects that once would have intrigued her were declined without explanation. To the outside world, it looked like rest, perhaps even contentment. To those who watched closely, it felt like something tightening inward, a deliberate narrowing of her world. In the final stretch of her life, Diane's days became increasingly structured and repetitive. She woke early, tended to her garden, prepared her own meals, and spent long hours alone with notebooks spread across a wide white table. Writing was no longer a professional exercise. It was private, unpolished, and never meant to be shared. She wrote fragments rather than narratives, thoughts rather than stories, observations about memory, questions about time, short lines that circled the same themes again and again. Loss without drama, solitude without apology. She was not documenting events. She was mapping an internal landscape that felt increasingly detached from the world she once inhabited. Friends who visited her during this period noticed subtle changes. Her humor remained, but it carried a softer edge. Her laughter arrived more slowly, often followed by long pauses. She listened more than she spoke. When she did speak, the conversation drifted toward abstractions rather than plans. She talked about light, about architecture, about the way certain rooms made her feel safe. She rarely mentioned the future. When asked about upcoming projects, she smiled and redirected the topic. It was not avoidance. It was clarity. The industry interpreted her absence in predictable ways. Rumors circulated quietly. Some speculated about health issues, others about cognitive decline. There was no confirmation because Diane never allowed one. She had always resisted being framed through limitation. She did not want sympathy. She did not want concern. She wanted privacy. Those closest to her respected that boundary, even when it meant watching her pull away from them as well. What made this period especially heavy was not illness or fear, but accumulation. Decades of memories began to surface with unusual intensity. Diane revisited old photographs obsessively, labeling them with dates, sometimes adding brief notes that only she would understand. She sorted through letters she had saved for years, rereading some, discarding others. The act was not nostalgic. It was curatorial. She was deciding what to keep close and what to let go. Memory had become weighty, no longer a source of comfort, but something that pressed inward. Her relationship with time changed. Days felt slower, yet shorter. She spoke about the past as if it were physically present, something she could almost touch. At the same time, the present felt fragile, easily disturbed. She avoided crowds, noise, and unpredictability. Silence was not emptiness to her. It was control. In silence, she could hear herself think without interruption. In silence, she did not have to perform coherence for anyone else. During this period, she also became increasingly preoccupied with the idea of disappearance. Not death in a biological sense, but erasure in a symbolic one. She questioned what it meant to leave a trace, whether legacy mattered if it no longer aligned with the person who created it. Fame, once a byproduct of her work, now felt intrusive. She disliked seeing her younger self replayed endlessly, frozen in moments that no longer reflected who she was. The past, which had once validated her, now felt like a version of herself she had outgrown. Conversations about mortality emerged naturally, without fear. She spoke of death not as an ending, but as a boundary, a point beyond which explanation no longer mattered. She was less concerned with how she would be remembered than with how she would feel in her final years. Peace, to her, did not mean happiness. It meant alignment, the absence of friction between her inner life and outer obligations. This inward turn affected even her closest relationships. She did not sever ties dramatically. She simply reduced them. Fewer visits, shorter conversations, long stretches of solitude punctuated by brief moments of connection. Her children sensed the change, but did not resist it. They understood that this was not withdrawal born of despair. It was something else, something chosen. She was not closing herself off from love. She was redefining the terms on which she accepted it. The final months were marked by an almost ritualistic calm. She arranged her space meticulously. Objects were placed deliberately. Nothing felt accidental. She spent more time sitting quietly, observing light as it moved across walls and floors. Sometimes she would sit by the window for hours without speaking, as if waiting for a thought to arrive. There was no visible anxiety, no urgency, only a steady inward focus that suggested resolution rather than decline. On the day she died, nothing disrupted that pattern. There was no sign of distress. She was found seated in her favorite chair, her notebook open, a cup of tea nearby. The absence of a farewell note was not an oversight. It was consistent with everything she had been doing. Diane Keaton did not believe in summarizing a life for public consumption. She believed in living it fully, then stepping away without commentary. The poem found beside her was brief, almost understated. It did not explain her choices. It did not apologize for them. It simply observed. When the noise ends, perhaps someone will hear the whisper. Those words were not meant to be decoded. They were meant to be accepted. Diane had spent her life speaking softly in a world that rewarded volume. In the end, she trusted that those who truly listened would understand. This period, often described as her disappearance, was in fact her final assertion of agency. She did not fade because she was forgotten. She faded because she chose to stop being visible. In doing so, she reclaimed something fame had slowly eroded: ownership of her own presence. The tragedy, if there is one, lies not in her solitude, but in how unfamiliar such a choice feels in a culture that equates visibility with existence. Diane Keaton existed fully until the end. She simply refused to be watched while doing so. The consequences of Diane Keaton's withdrawal did not erupt immediately. Tributes became retrospective rather than anticipatory. She was no longer part of the present tense of the industry, and that shift unsettled people more than they admitted. An artist who had shaped generations was no longer participating in the cycle that celebrated her. There was no farewell tour, no final role framed as a goodbye. The silence itself became the story. Those who had worked closely with her felt a quiet disorientation. Directors who once relied on her instincts struggled to articulate what was missing, only sensing that something essential had slipped away. Younger actors spoke of her influence with reverence, yet many had never met her. She had become a reference point rather than a presence. That transformation carried weight. It forced the industry to confront a question it rarely asks. What happens when someone refuses to be consumed by their own legacy? For the public, her retreat was often interpreted as fragility. Commentators speculated about age, about relevance, about the emotional toll of a long career. But these interpretations missed the deeper impact. Diane Keaton did not retreat because she could not continue. She retreated because continuing no longer served her inner life. That choice disrupted the familiar narrative of decline. There was no dramatic fall to mourn, only a gradual removal that left observers uneasy because it could not be framed as failure. Within her personal circle, the effects were more intimate. Friends adjusted to her new rhythm, learning not to expect immediacy or explanation. Some felt the distance as loss. Others understood it as boundary. Relationships changed shape. They became quieter, more deliberate, stripped of casual presence. When she did engage, her attention was complete. When she withdrew, it was total. There was little middle ground. This clarity, while honest, required others to adapt in ways that were not always comfortable. Her children experienced the shift differently. They witnessed a mother who was increasingly inward, yet deeply composed. There was no sense of abandonment. Instead, there was a growing emphasis on autonomy. She encouraged independence, not through instruction, but through example. She demonstrated what it meant to stand alone without resentment. That lesson, subtle and demanding, would resonate long after her death. It asked for strength without validation. The broader cultural response to her withdrawal revealed more about the audience than about her. In an era defined by constant sharing, her silence felt confrontational. People searched for meaning where none was offered. They wanted a reason that could be consumed, debated, resolved. Diane offered none. The refusal itself became the impact. She forced a reconsideration of how much access a public figure owes the public. By stepping back completely, she exposed the assumption that visibility is a moral obligation. After her death, the reactions intensified. Tributes poured in, filled with admiration and confusion. Many praised her bravery without fully understanding what that bravery entailed. Others expressed regret that she had not allowed the world closer at the end. These responses reflected a collective discomfort with endings that do not perform. Diane Keaton did not provide closure in a traditional sense. She did not shape her exit to comfort others. She prioritized coherence over consolation. The long-term impact of her final years lies not in mystery, but in precedent. She demonstrated that a life of artistic contribution does not require perpetual presence. That disengagement can be an act of integrity rather than surrender. This idea unsettled an industry built on continuity and consumption. Her absence became a quiet critique of systems that measure worth by output rather than alignment. Emotionally, the aftermath carried a particular weight. Fans revisited her work with new eyes, noticing the restraint, the pauses, the moments of introspection that had always been there. Scenes once read as charming or idiosyncratic now felt prophetic. Her performances contained an awareness of impermanence long before it became personal. The sadness many felt after her death was not only grief. It was recognition, a realization that she had been telling a quieter story all along. Her isolation, often described as tragic, revealed itself to be complex. It was not a symptom of despair, but a response to saturation. After decades of being observed, she reclaimed the right not to be interpreted. That decision carried consequences. It limited connection. It invited misunderstanding. it also preserved something essential: her sense of authorship over her own life. The impact on those left behind was not explosive. It was contemplative. People spoke more softly when discussing her. Conversations lingered. There was less certainty, more reflection. In that way, her influence continued, not through spectacle, but through tone. She shifted the emotional register of remembrance itself. In the end, the consequences of Diane Keaton's final years cannot be measured by box office figures or public appearances missed. They are measured by the questions she left unresolved. About aging, about presence, about the courage it takes to step away without explanation. Her silence did not diminish her legacy. It complicated it, and in doing so, it invited a deeper form of respect, one that does not demand access, only understanding. There are stories that never reached interviews, moments that never found their way into memoirs or public reflection. These were not secrets in the conventional sense. They were fragments of a private interior life Diane Keaton guarded carefully, not out of fear, but out of respect for their fragility. In the years after she withdrew from public view, these quiet details became the true architecture of her days, invisible to most, yet central to who she had become. One of the most striking habits she developed was her relationship with letters. Not correspondence meant to be sent, but letters written and folded away, some sealed, others left open. They were addressed to people from different chapters of her life. A mother whose approval she chased long after childhood had ended. Men she had loved deeply but never fully merged with. Versions of herself that existed only in memory. She did not reread these letters obsessively. Often she wrote them once and never returned to them. The act itself mattered more than the preservation. Writing allowed her to speak without interruption, without correction, without the pressure of response. Those close to her described evenings when she would sit alone at her table, pen in hand, not moving for long stretches. There was no sense of urgency. She was not racing against time. She was listening inward. Sometimes she would tear a page out immediately after finishing it. Other times, she placed it carefully into a folder labeled only with a date. These gestures were not dramatic. They were methodical. Diane had always approached emotion with structure, as if order could make feeling more bearable. Another quiet ritual involved photographs. She collected images obsessively, not of herself, but of spaces, textures, and light. Doorways half open, empty rooms after sunset, gardens just before dusk. These photographs were never exhibited. They were never curated for an audience. They existed as a record of presence without performance. In them, there were no faces demanding interpretation, no narratives imposed. Just stillness. For Diane, these images represented a form of honesty she rarely found in words. Friends who visited her during this period noticed how carefully she managed conversation. She asked thoughtful questions, listened intently, but rarely offered details about her own emotional state. When concern was expressed, she redirected gently, not dismissively, but decisively. She did not want her solitude to be mistaken for suffering. Yet she also did not romanticize it. She acknowledged moments of heaviness, especially at night, when memory crowded the quiet. She did not deny loneliness. She simply refused to dramatize it. One of the most revealing details shared privately was her habit of walking through her house late at night, turning lights on and off, adjusting objects by inches. Chairs moved slightly closer to windows. Books repositioned. Plants rotated toward light. These were not symptoms of restlessness. They were acts of alignment. She believed that space affected thought, and thought affected peace. By shaping her environment carefully, she felt she could soften the internal noise that had followed her for most of her life. There were also moments of unexpected vulnerability. On rare occasions, she spoke about fear, not of death, but of forgetting. Forgetting the sound of her mother's voice. Forgetting the exact weight of certain moments that had once defined her. Memory, which she had curated so carefully, felt unstable. To counter this, She began writing down sensory details rather than events. The smell of old paper, the way afternoon light stretched across the floor, the sound of leaves brushing against windows. These details grounded her when broader narratives felt unreliable. Perhaps the most telling quiet story involved a notebook discovered after her death. It did not contain confessions or revelations. It held lists, lists of words she loved, lists of questions she never answered, lists of things she no longer needed. Fame appeared once, crossed out. Approval appeared twice, underlined, then crossed out. Silence appeared many times, never altered. The notebook was not meant to be read. It was meant to be lived with. What these small stories reveal is not a woman consumed by regret, but one engaged in deliberate simplification. Diane Keaton was not trying to resolve her life into a neat conclusion. She was stripping it back to essentials. In doing so, she accepted contradictions without needing to explain them. She was grateful and dissatisfied, independent and longing, peaceful and restless. These states coexisted without canceling each other out. The people who understood her best recognized that her withdrawal was not a retreat from love, but a refusal to dilute it. She chose fewer connections, but deeper ones. Fewer words, but more accurate ones. In a world that often mistakes exposure for intimacy, she pursued the opposite path. She believed that meaning survived best in restraint. These untold stories, quiet and incomplete, form the emotional core of her final years. They do not resolve the mystery of her life. They deepen it. They show a woman who spent decades being interpreted, finally choosing to exist without annotation. Her silence was not emptiness. It was fullness without display. And in that fullness, she found a way to remain entirely herself, even as she stepped away from the world that had watched her for so long. By the time the world began speaking about Diane Keaton in the past tense, she had already resolved her own relationship with legacy. Not as something to be defended or curated for public memory, but as something that existed independently of her participation. She understood that legacy, once released, no longer belongs to its creator. It belongs to those who encounter it, reinterpret it, and project their own meanings onto it. That understanding freed her from the impulse to manage how she would be remembered. Diane Keaton did not believe that achievement guaranteed fulfillment. Her career offered proof of excellence, not proof of peace. She spoke often, in private, about the difference between success and alignment. Success, she felt, was externally measured and endlessly negotiable. Alignment was internal and non-transferable. In her later years, alignment became her priority. She evaluated her life not by milestones reached, but by friction reduced. The quieter her days became, the closer she felt to herself. The paradox of her legacy lies in this withdrawal. She became more influential by refusing to perform influence. At a time when aging women in entertainment are encouraged to remain visible at all costs, her decision to step away without apology reframed what dignity could look like. She did not frame her silence as wisdom, nor did she romanticize retreat. She simply treated it as a natural evolution. That refusal to dramatize became its own statement, one far more radical than any public declaration. Her body of work remains, not as a monument, but as a conversation. Watching her performances now reveals layers that were once overlooked. The pauses feel intentional rather than hesitant. The restraint reads as emotional intelligence rather than quirk. Her characters often stood slightly apart from the world they inhabited, observant, ironic, searching for coherence rather than conquest. In hindsight, these roles feel less like acting and more like rehearsal. She was practicing a way of being that would later define her life. There's a temptation to frame her final years as a lesson, to extract a moral that can be easily consumed. Resist conformity. Choose silence. Age on your own terms. But Diane Keaton did not offer prescriptions. She offered presence. Her life suggests that meaning is not something to be broadcast. It is something to be lived privately, sometimes even invisibly. The discomfort many feel when confronting her choices reflects a broader cultural unease with autonomy that does not seek validation. Her legacy also forces a reevaluation of loneliness. Society often treats solitude as a deficit, something to be solved or explained away. Diane treated it as a condition to be shaped. She acknowledged its weight without pathologizing it. She accepted its costs without resenting its benefits. In doing so, she modeled a form of emotional honesty rarely celebrated. She showed that solitude can be chosen without bitterness, that independence does not require isolation, and that withdrawal does not always signal despair. Perhaps the most enduring aspect of her legacy is the permission she granted without ever asking for recognition. Permission to age without apology. Permission to disengage without explanation. Permission to value coherence over applause. These permissions were not granted through advocacy or manifesto. They were embodied quietly, consistently, over time. That is why they endure. They were lived, not argued. In reflecting on her life, one must resist the urge to resolve her contradictions. She was admired yet insecure, independent yet longing, public yet private. These were not flaws to be corrected. They were tensions she carried consciously. Rather than eliminating them, she learned to live within them. That acceptance shaped her final years more than any external circumstance. She did not seek clarity by simplifying herself. She sought peace by allowing complexity to remain unresolved. The legacy she leaves is therefore not one of answers, but of posture, a way of standing in the world without demanding it look back, a way of exiting without needing to be chased. Her silence was not an absence of voice, but a refusal to fill space unnecessarily. In a culture addicted to noise, that refusal reads as courage. Diane Keaton did not attempt to be eternal. She accepted impermanence without spectacle. Her work continues to speak because it was never designed to shout. Her life continues to provoke because it was never designed to instruct. She lived according to an internal measure that remained consistent even as the world around her shifted. That consistency, more than fame or accolades, is what defines her legacy. When future generations look back, they may remember her films, her style, her distinctive presence. But beneath those markers lies something quieter and more enduring. The example of a woman who knew when to step forward and when to step away, and who treated both choices with equal integrity. In the end, there was no curtain call, no final image designed to fix Diane Keaton in collective memory. What remained was quieter, less obedient to narrative. A house filled with light, objects arranged with care, pages written without an audience. Her life did not close with resolution, but with continuity, as if she had simply stepped into another room where the noise could no longer follow. For those who searched for a clear conclusion, this felt unsettling. For Diane, it felt honest. Her story resists summary because she resisted simplification. She was never comfortable being reduced to a symbol, even when that symbol worked in her favor. She understood that identity, once frozen, becomes a burden. So she kept moving internally, shedding versions of herself that no longer fit. Actress, icon, muse. Each role was inhabited fully, then released. The last role she played was the most private one, a woman choosing how to live when no one was watching. The public response to her passing revealed how deeply she had marked people, often without their realizing it. Viewers revisited her films and found themselves lingering on moments they once rushed past. A pause before a line, a look held a second too long, a smile that arrived imperfectly. These details now felt like signals rather than quirks. She had always been pointing towards something quieter, something beyond performance. Her death did not create that meaning. It illuminated what had been there all along. Many asked whether her final years should be read as sadness or fulfillment. The question itself exposes a cultural impatience with ambiguity. Diane did not choose between joy and sorrow. She accepted their coexistence. Her retreat was not a verdict on her life, nor an escape from it. It was a refinement. She removed what felt unnecessary and kept what felt true. That process was neither tragic nor triumphant. It was human. Diane Keaton did not ask to be understood in full. She understood that complete understanding is a myth, especially when projected onto another person. What she offered instead was consistency. She lived according to her values, even when those values conflicted with expectation. She did not correct the misunderstandings that followed. She allowed them to exist, trusting that time would soften judgment, if not clarify it. Her final gesture, if it can be called that, was restraint. In a world that demands explanation, she offered silence. In a culture that equates presence with worth, she demonstrated that absence can also carry meaning. This is not a lesson easily absorbed. It challenges the reflex to perform identity for validation. It asks for a different kind of courage. The courage to be sufficient without witnesses. As the years pass, her story will likely be retold many times. Some will emphasize her achievements. Others will focus on her solitude. Both perspectives risk missing the point. Her life was not a cautionary tale, nor was it a blueprint. It was an example of authorship. She claimed the right to shape her own narrative, including its ending, without negotiating with public expectation. That autonomy, exercised quietly, is what makes her story endure. There's something deeply unsettling and deeply comforting in that choice. Unsettling because it offers no easy takeaway. Comforting because it affirms the possibility of living without constant justification. Diane Keaton did not attempt to be remembered correctly. She trusted that those who needed her story would find what they needed within it. The image that lingers is not of a star fading, but of a woman at peace with incompleteness, sitting by a window, writing a line that does not explain itself, allowing the world to continue without her commentary. That image resists closure, and perhaps that is the point. Some lives are not meant to conclude with answers. They conclude with presence, then quiet. As listeners, viewers, readers, we are left with questions rather than conclusions. What does it mean to live fully without being consumed by visibility? When is withdrawal an act of strength rather than surrender? How much of ourselves do we owe to the world that watches us? Diane Keaton did not answer these questions. She embodied them. Her legacy, then, is not a final statement, but an open space, an invitation to reconsider how we measure fulfillment, how we interpret silence, how we allow others to leave without demanding explanations. She stepped away on her own terms, without noise, without spectacle, without permission. And in doing so, she left behind something rare. Not certainty, but clarity of intention. That clarity continues to resonate because it does not insist. It waits, like a whisper that can only be heard when the noise finally ends.